All right, everybody, I am here with the legendary. I've been talking about him, telling different stories about him for a long time. Your legend has been growing. I am here with Tal Muskal, the CTO of LiquidApps. Welcome back to Everything EOS, Tal.
Hi, good to be here again.
It's been a journey. It's been a while. So people who haven't been following us, Tal and the CEO of LiquidApps, Benny, you guys were both on Everything EOS back in like March. It was a four-way interview. It was myself, you, Benny, and Peter K.
It feels like ages ago.
It was right after the DAP Network launched a little over 6 months ago, back in March. And little did we know where we would be 6 months later. Myself and Peter K are now with LiquidApps. The services built on top of the network has grown. But I don't really, we'll get into DAP Network stuff and LiquidApps stuff. But what I really wanted to talk about today is Tal Muskal. Because this is actually, honestly, it's a treat for me. I don't get to have this much time with Tal in my capacity with LiquidApps. One of the number one rules at LiquidApps is do not distract Tal, because Tal is doing very important tasks and he doesn't need to be sidetracked. So to have this time with him is a treat for myself, and I kind of want to dive into who Tal is as a person, his approaches to development, engineering, and just to see if the legends are true. I've heard things. I saw Saeed Jaffrey's calling you out as being a genius in Telegram. It's definitely something I believe, and I think after this conversation, I think other people might get a better idea of the legend that is Tal Muskal. So who is Tal Muskal?
Who am I? First, I'm a developer, I would say. From the first memory I had, I think I was a programmer, coder. So that's first.
There's a little biography of you. I think I found it on Crunchbase. It says you're born in Israel and that you're an autodidact. How do I say that? Autodidact? I know what it means.
I think so, yeah.
A singularitarian, which we'll get into later, because this is a passion of yours and it's super interesting, and a hacker. That's how you probably wrote this yourself years ago. It might be a little bit old, but that's how you described yourself.
Yeah, I think that's still a pretty accurate way to describe. And a hacker, not in a malicious kind of way, but a hacker in the sense that I love taking system and reuse them for other things they weren't exactly designed for. Or I think that's kind of the way I think.
I've kind of built you up on this channel here. I shared a story that's been passed around a few times about being on the team that built Deep Junior. What's the story behind this? Because I think it's grown into almost a tall tale, and it was one of the things that kind of blew my mind whenever you mentioned that.
So first, yeah. So I think it kind of maybe grew out of proportion a little bit. Some people were saying that I built it, but I actually our chief scientist in Semantic Web was a guy who built it, and he came to me and used my help to scale it basically from a single-threaded application to a distributed system. Because that's the kind of thing that I'm familiar with the most.
That last sentence you said, you took something that was single-threaded.
Yeah, and all in RAM, and try to make it run in multiple machines, and make it distributed and more efficient. Yeah.
Sounds a little bit familiar to where we're at today with blockchains and EOSIO in particular.
Yeah, with the cryptographic and game theory challenges on top of that, which is another entirely different aspect and layer that's on top of those old challenges, I would say.
you, you've done some impressive things. You mentioned it a little bit ago. A company called Semantic Net. Is that how I say it? Semantic
Right.
Net.
Yeah.
You sent me some information about what you're building there, and I almost got the idea that you were on the right path, but you were too early on this. Like, could you kind of describe at a high level what
Sure.
you built? Like, this is over 10 years ago with this company called Semantinet, which is one of your previous projects years ago.
Yeah, it was a long journey. Basically, it started 14 years ago. Basically, it was a company that Tal Kainan, my partner, and I started back then. Basically, we were trying to bring what was later called the intelligent web, basically, which is a vision where everybody can provide their piece of information and piece of functionality and have like a smart layer that understand what to put in what context and basically have a seamless integration of everything that's accessible to us basically online, which is whether it's functionality, APIs, or just information that needs to be cataloged and tubed in, and routed in the right way. So that was the vision there. And we thought that the best way to do it was basically to create a distributed system where everybody can contribute their own functionality and extend the functionality of the system. It was a very interesting project, and after a while we added a layer of semantic understanding, of natural language understanding, which made the whole thing even better, because you could basically write free-form sentences and utilize the entire network to integrate basically functionalities from different sites and different APIs. So that was interesting.
That particular piece right there, you sent me some documents, and it almost looked like you were doing like things that Siri does today, like your like AI, like personal assistant. That's kind of what you were building, but back in like 2006, 2008, like in that time frame, you started building this, and it was like what a Firefox extension, I think, is what I read.
Yeah, but we were back then. It wasn't that popular to build platform basically as a business strategy. So everybody told us you need to build a killer application, something that will showcase the power of that platform. Mm-hmm. And basically we failed with that product. It didn't really. It couldn't really grasp the potential of such a platform. And I think that's one of the reasons the entire vision of that semantic web failed. Up until this day, it didn't fulfill itself because there was a lack of incentives, there was a lack of a killer application, because the entire power from that comes from the long tail of connectivities that you can do with all those kinds of data sources. On the other hand, for every killer application, someone just builds something that's tailored, and then you don't need that kind of flexibility. So it lacked that kind of incentive to build horizontal killer applications. And I think maybe it will be back someday. That kind of vision when there's enough infrastructure in place for that to monetize data, for example. That's something that companies are still struggling today on how to do.
What was the journey like from you, like first getting into software all the way until what led you to blockchain? Like what are the key highlights if you had to like just pluck a few out?
So I think my first journey with software and entrepreneurship was something called Vocalize in '96. So what I did was like a little application that you would hum a song that you couldn't get out of your head, and it would recognize the song basically. And back then there weren't even MP3s or any way to monetize anything on the internet. Nobody even really used the internet yet, like in the common audience, and it taught me a really great lesson about coming too early.
That what you just described, that there was an app that was popular that did that with like a song on the radio. It would tell you what the song was called. But you're saying in 1996 you had something that didn't even have to hear the actual song, just like the tune of it via like humming it. That's insane.
I started, from things that I needed myself. I really love music, and I wanted it, and and then I had some mentors that told me, listen, if you want to build a business out of it, you need to think of a way to monetize it. And then I got and then I had to join the army, basically, and I had to shut it down.
Just for context, for context with the army, you're Israeli in Israel. Does everyone have to go into the army? I'm actually not sure.
Basically it's a mandatory service in Israel.
So you're about to hit your groove and then duty called.
Yeah. And people told me you're either going to be a good soldier or a good entrepreneur. So you can do both, basically. So I chose to be a good soldier. After I was done with the army service, basically I joined a company that did embedded real-time development for Wi-Fi mesh networks. So that was my first time that I basically got to work on a distributed system and got to think, in a distributed perspective. I did use, peer-to-peer file sharing services back in the day. In Israel, it was very common. So I was familiar with the technology, and I did some emule patches back in the day. But that was the first time I really got to work, on the bits and bytes and trying to make a distributed system much better. And it taught me quite a lot, both on the aspects of operating system development, because back then companies weren't using open source software to run embedded systems. They were using other commercial operating systems. They weren't using Linux or embedded Linux back then.
What time frame was this?
2004.
Yeah.
So we kind of I kind of somehow I convinced the team, even though I was very young. I convinced, even in that space, I convinced the team to consider taking this amazing thing that's open and trying to build a product with it, like a real hardware product that's working and shipped to consumers. So we were kind of pioneering in that space without really even knowing. So it led me to really, embrace this whole model of open source. And I had a couple of years where I was consulting companies how to move to open source projects to replace their old legacy systems. That was a great journey to have.
So you're basically like in the weeds from the transition of everything was closed source to once like open source started becoming more and more acceptable. And then do you feel like blockchain and like these incentivized like economies and systems is like the next step of open source?
Definitely.
The next iteration.
Yeah, it's exactly that. I think that's one of the things, one of the amazing things, models in general, licensing models and incentive models around open source that was always interesting to me is the kind of system that allowed people to collaborate in the first place on and why to release open source other than kind of like a gift economy kind of thing where it's never as good as the competitor that had that have a lot of resources and can always beat a project that's done in people's spare time. But then GPL came along and licenses that kind of kept the incentives aligned, and it was pretty groundbreaking because.
Could you explain what GPL is?
Sure. Basically, it's a software license that back then it was very efficient in enforcing people to contribute back fixes and changes and enhancements that they did in an open source project. Mm-hmm. And that led big companies to actually invest in open source projects and put people and developers and pay their salaries to work on something that is open. And I think that was a really interesting thing. People may argue or debate if it really worked or if it's still working, but I think it was very interesting and it won in a lot of verticals.
Did you realize it was a really big deal when it first started happening and the licensing first started appearing, or did it take a little bit of time to sink in?
Like everything, I think like everything that I get into, it feels like it was a slow process, but in retrospect, I was an early adopter. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Same as happened to me in cloud services. I felt I was feeling I missed the train, but I was just, it existed, I don't know, 2 years before I joined, and back then it was nothing, and I just became an expert just by being there early.
Mm-hmm. What took you from there to where we're at today? Like, what happened from there?
About 2 years ago, my friend and the co-founder in the previous companies in edXtent and Semantinet came to me and kind of shaked me and listened and told me, listen, you really have to look at blockchain now. Like that I can't let you not do it anymore. You have to look at it. There are a couple of problems that you have to solve basically, and I trust you to solve them. And basically we discussed it and we came to a conclusion that there are a couple of things, that the vision is great and the potential is amazing, but there are 4 problems that will probably are big barriers right now, and until each of them are solved, it's probably not going to fulfill itself like we envision. The first one was resources costs, whether it's gas fees in Ethereum or RAM cost in EOS, or whether it's development that's way more complicated on blockchains currently. So that was one big aspect that I think that important for this whole vision to fulfill itself. The other aspect that we felt is kind of lacking is the ability to connect different blockchains. Basically, the blockchains were islands, like silos of value and functionality, and there must be a way to have the network effects and connectivity and basically build a mesh network of all the blockchains.
I get it now. We were talking about the mesh networks you were working on over a decade ago. Now we're back to mesh networks.
Yeah.
Full circle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's the next logical step, and you see it in every kind of system. In every kind of distributed system where the hierarchy builds up, and basically you get specialized silos, and the fact they are connected, everyone can specialize in its own thing, and instead of compete on the same thing. Another point that we felt is kind of lacking is the ability to connect to the outside world from a contract. Basically, contracts are very useful, and even if we do a mesh network of all the chains, it's still an island by itself. It's not connected to the day-to-day and to everything else we know, and to the value that's outside. And that brings me to the fourth point, which is the value that is outside. The fiat, basically what we call fiat onboarding. So that's another challenge where the majority of the value in the systems exist outside of this ecosystem. So there should be a bridge, a very good bridge from value to go in and out from those systems to the outside world, not just data. And that's another challenge that I think it's still a challenge these days. So I was thinking of what's the best way, not just to solve those problems, but what's the best way to architect the technology, or maybe re-architect the technology in order for those problems to be solved, independently, and not be, in a monolithic kind of technology. And it brought me back to the layers vision, to the ability to encapsulate things in layers of abstractions, and how a blockchain should probably be layered, multi-layered, instead of having one kind of monolith, basically be in charge of everything, whether it's communication, peer-to-peer, consensus, execution language, basic functions. I think that model can be improved, basically. So it started building kind of a prototype for a layered blockchain, which is kind of a graph-based chain. You could say it's similar to IOTA in some ways, but where every branch of the graph is kind of can have a different consensus mechanism. So I call it block space. It was an interesting project where the consensus is a layer, the languages of execution is a different layer that you could extend, and the resource management is an entirely different layer. Permissions is a layer on its own. Communication and all those things basically were kind of layered. And then I saw that EOS is doing the basic, let's say the basic layers pretty well, with WASM and everything. That my implementation was with basically containers as the execution layer instead of WASM, and basically making sure the container execution is deterministic. But that's a fun story for another time. But then Tal Kenan introduced me to the Bancor guys, and we talked a little bit, and we clicked, and we shared a lot of similar visions, and they convinced me to join and to lead the Bancor X solution. they were kind of impressed that I built the blockchain as a homework, as a homework assignment over 2 weekends. So they wanted to let me lead that. um, and then as part of LiquidEOS, we basically built Bancor X with the great developers at Bancor. You know that back when they hired me, I had 3 months of experience with blockchain. Like this entire story happened in 3 months.
So 2018 was your first like entry into like really diving into the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And
I've heard about Bitcoin before, and I was familiar with the technology, and I thought it was quite inefficient to hold replicas for everything on every participant, but and to do a competition of whoever wastes more energy is next in line. I found it a bit ridiculous. Now I understand better, but still, I think it's I think that in April I really got in April 2018 I really dived into the rabbit hole. It was an interesting experiment. I think bootstrapping a blockchain is much more than the technology. It's a lot more. It's bootstrapping a community, and I was. The technology was interesting, but I learned a lot from EOS and being a part of launching the mainnet and being one of the top block producers when the mainnet launched. That taught me a lot about how to build a project and community. I think Block.One did an amazing job. I was actually quite skeptic that it will go as smooth as it did. Because I don't think I've ever seen a project that was written by one company and then launched without the help of that company, like completely independent of that company for the first time in production, and it went amazingly well. Like I was a bit skeptical at first, but as soon as I met the people before the launch, and I got more and more confident that crazy approach is actually going to work.
Mm-hmm. So me being, a normal person of normal intelligence, not genius level here. What was your impressions of Dan Larimer from one Yoda to another Yoda?
He's definitely a genius. Definitely, I think, and he had his visions, for quite a long time as well. And like me, he eats his own dog food and planning to utilize the platform to really build the things that he built the platform for. They say that you can really know how good someone is if you sat and wrote code with him. In the army, it's like if you really slept near him in a tent, and so it's in coding. It's if you did a whole night of coding with someone, then you know how good it is. And so I haven't got a chance to do it with Dan. But I imagine he's quite a legend, as they say that he is. I've watched a lot of his code on GitHub. You can measure in the beginning of the project how much a person does. So he's also have a lot of capacity in his fingers.
That's funny that when we were in Washington, D.C. for B1 June, people, at least 3 people off the top of my head said that about you. Looking at your code, so I don't know what it was about it. I just remember 3 different people said, like, he's got really good code. And I'm like, geez, you can just tell.
So that's one of the fun things about an open source project, which has an engaged community around it, is that people actually notice and appreciate the thinking that you put into things, and even provide the feedback that they're like, for the first time in my life, people write me, I love that line of code because I learned something from it, and that's amazing because people appreciate the time that you put into to the details of things.
We just recently celebrated 6 months since the DAP network launched, and we celebrated it with a teaser for a hackathon. And I do want to share another Tal story about EOS hackathons, because we've told the story on here a bunch of times of how I met Tal for the first time at the San Francisco hackathon, the EOSIO Global Hackathon. And Tal was a mentor there, and everyone was like, that's the smartest guy here. But you told a story a couple weeks ago about how you really actually wanted to compete in that hackathon, but instead you're kind of forced to become a mentor.
I wouldn't say forced, but
forced.
But yeah. I the first time that I heard the hackathon, and I lived nearby, and I think they were talking about the fact that BPs are not allowed to participate. So I was thinking to participate, independently, and I didn't have a team, and I wanted to just compete myself as a one person, and I really planned to win the hackathon. Actually, I told the guys at Bangor, I think, listen, guys, I'm going to compete. I'm going to take a couple of days, and I'm going to win this.
Only you could just walk into a hackathon and be like, yep, I'm going to win this. And everyone around you that knows you well enough actually believes you.
I think that's the first time I met the community face to face.
Me too. Mind blowing, eye opening.
It was amazing. Yeah, and it was amazing to realize that the people are such amazing people. I've been in a lot of kind of communities and tech communities, and I really think that we have something special here. And that 100%. That makes the difference. That thing.
Was that the only hackathon you went to last year? Was the San Francisco?
Yeah. Other than private hackathons that I do in my spare time in the weekend alone, trying to hack things together.
I don't even think we even gave, I don't know where we're going to be on the edited version of this, but we're probably at least 30 minutes through in the edited version, and we never got to what is LiquidApps and what is DAP Network at a very high level, introduced by the man who architected it. So what is DAP Network, and what do you envision it becoming?
So going back to the layered architecture of blockchain, I think LiquidApp is kind of the model to place those layers on top of. It's basically the meta building block to construct the layers with. So right now we have a second layer solution for things like resources and the basic functionalities. But as the network grows and the community grows, we'll probably see, third layers on top of that do things that are more in the applicative layer, in the applicative space. Things like KYC services that are not really a developer resource that it's more of a service that developer needs to use, not a core resource that he needs to manage. So in that sense, it's you can think of it as a third layer for those third services.
When I try to describe DAP Network and the problems it's solving to someone who knows nothing about it, I try to explain it like, we have all of these silos of DApps and their own development teams, and they're all kind of trying to solve the same problems over and over again. Like free accounts is something everyone's needed, and we've seen projects like EOS Bet and others build their own virtual account system, but then it's not interoperable and no one else could really gain from that. So like we have liquid accounts, which is solving that problem, making it very easy for a DApp to add this functionality without investing a bunch of their own resources to build it from scratch, like companies previously may have had to have done. Same thing with oracles. Instead of having to develop your own oracle, we have this oracle service that you have, and an entire network of DSPs you could choose from. So it's just kind of removing all of the different bottlenecks that occur whenever you're just trying to develop a general use case application. There's certain things that you're going to need to build in your own little silo. And I think the best thing to compare it to is we leading up to the EOS mainnet and the narrative around EOS and Block.One and Dan was that Dan built previous blockchains, so we ran into limitations, and by building the second and the third one, he realized all of these things you have to do every time you want to build a new blockchain. So he just built a general use case like blockchain platform that everyone could build on top of and do whatever they wanted to do, so that they didn't have to build a blockchain from scratch. And that's where we're at with just the EOSIO base layer. But then I think the DAP layer, it kind of gives them everything else beyond that. And it's very similar to your experience is very similar in that way, where Dan built previous blockchains, and then his third generation blockchain is like the grand vision. Whereas with you've been building this other thing. It wasn't in a blockchain industry because it didn't even exist at the time, but you've iterated over these ideas, and now we're here. We have this base layer that you're building on top of. Now you want to add these service layers so that a developer could build a distributed, decentralized, autonomous project, and they don't have to they're basically able to hit the ground running because they could skip all of these building block steps that every developer before DAP Network has had to do.
Usually when I build platforms, the first users of the platform is me. I want to use it myself, and it feels like we're really starting to get to the tipping point where it's really you have enough of the tool sets and enough of things that you don't need to worry about in order to accomplish things fast, and that's basically the end goal. In conventional software, we had the concept of reusing things that other people built, but when you talk about blockchain technologies, it's not enough that things are open source. You also need distributed entities to actually run the code. Even if you're a developer and you want to create your own solution for something, unless you get a layer of participants that have the right incentives, you basically have a weak link of decentralization because you're running your own service. Mm-hmm. So that's another interesting aspect, that it's not even a technological aspect. It's a complication from the nature of blockchain itself and the game theory around it. I think that it brings you back to the question of what's the end goal, like what's the end goal of decentralization and those kind of technologies in the first place, and what's even the goal of making an immortal application. So it's more than doing things that people don't want you to do. I think immortal applications and decentralization and uncensorship in general, and I think it all comes down to freedom. To freedom to participate in the systems that control our lives and the system that we're a part of. And many times, most times, collaboration between people has a toll of centralization, and centralization leads to abuse of power and corruption and inefficient things. So it's basically the freedom to do it more efficiently, to collaborate more efficiently, the freedom to participate in the systems that controls you.
Immortal Applications. Is this a term that you kind of just made up, or is it like used elsewhere in other like communities?
I don't think so. I at least never heard of it. It just fit the concept pretty well, I think. It was back in the Liquid EOS days when we were envisioning like a registry where people could register their IPFS URI to point to a front end, and that way you could kind of make a application that's basically unhackable and you're unable to bring it down, and it's basically immortal. And that's a very powerful thing in the ability for people to collaborate around anything without having other groups of power interfere. And an immortal application is basically an application that is not in control of anyone from end to end. That once it's out there, nobody can change how it behaves, and nobody can manipulate it, and nobody can abuse the logic in it, and basically something that's going to stay there forever.
So within a Immortal app, though, you say it can never be taken down, never be upgraded. Does that mean, in your conception of what an Immortal app is, that you'd burn the keys? No one would have the keys?
Yeah, either no one will have the keys, or a multi-party that is big enough and that can upgrade the contract without colluding.
So something like a DAO could manage an Immortal app?
Yep, exactly.
We did spend a lot of time on your background and stuff. I think like the original plan was to get people to know you and not so much focus on LiquidApps. And I think we did a good bit of that.
No, I didn't touch labor at all.
Okay, so the labor part is
we can skip that, and it's not like I'm going over my resume. And we can always do a follow up.
No. You're talking the man-machine collaboration.
Yeah, and processes and but I'll tell you a little bit about it. Basically, I've been thinking a lot of how to take management and management processes and making them in software. Whether it's taking a project and breaking it down to pieces and contracting every little piece to a different contractor on a crowdsourcing platform like Fiverr or whatever. Mm-hmm. And whether it's trying to create liquidity for work, basically. If you think about it, work, an hour of work, of skilled work, doesn't have liquidity today. If you want someone to work on something, you probably have the right context to participate in your collaboration and your organization. You need a lot of context. You need to hire him probably, mm-hmm. or have a long-term relationship and trust. And it's not like that you can get, let's think a logo designer. Okay, it's not like you can have a specs for a logo and have an exchange of hours of logo design hours, which is standard. You know what you get for this kind of hour, and it's all have the same quality for an hour.
Market by logo design.
Right. It's not something. So skilled work is not something that's. So it doesn't have a liquidity yet, so it can't have a market and a rapid market for those things. And this is one reason that you can't build an efficient system that can utilize basically utilize each and every skill that people can offer and combine them into something that can collaborate much faster than a human can manage people. So that's basically where I'm going with this, and I had a few projects in that vision or in that direction, I would say, and I can go over them. One was basically something that you could a marketplace where you could write tests, and someone else could write code to pass your tests, and basically. Only if he wrote code that passed your tests, he would get your bounty, basically. So it's like a verified bounty system for pieces of code and tests that run to verify them. So that's a kind of an effort to create liquidity around programming, basically around functions, or writing functions in code.
It's also serving the purpose of almost like, I don't know if it's quite gamifying, but it's definitely incentivizing. Like you have a bounty on passing this test, that's incentive for people to come do it. And the more people that want to come do it, that's more liquidity for that particular task.
Right. And back when I was building that project, people told me I wanted to basically create a coin per kind of skill task. And people told me, listen, you should really look into Ethereum and blockchain because that tokenization is exactly what's happening there right now. But I only came to that later.
It's funny the way you describe some of these ideas of yours, because there's projects that are currently being built that in a way try to solve some of these problems or build or approach these problems. So like for the passing the tests and the code, like looking at something like NuGet and what they're trying to accomplish, I could see some similarities there. Then when you're talking about liquidity on a labor market, I think Effect AI and
definitely.
I'm excited for that project to I think it's public. They've said that they're going to be launching a DSP and using certain services, possibly even offering their own services that are unique to what they're doing. I remember whenever I had Chris from Effect AI on Everything EOS, I came to you for advice because I knew AI and human collaboration was one of your personal interests. And you told me some different things about crowd wisdom and things like that. What are your thoughts on the Effect AI project, and what kind of things are possible with these like these man-machine collaborative workforces that you're describing, whether through something like Effect AI or something that hasn't even been built yet? What does this man-machine collaboration look like? What's your vision for this?
So imagine like something like writing a screencast for an application, like something that's very niche and specific, but it's kind of have a recipe on how to do that. So there's the production and the animation and people that need to narrate the voice and people to write the description of the product and for every scene and someone to decide what gets into the screencast and what features are important enough to talk about. So it's like an entire process, but it's more or less the same for every screencast that you produce. Mm-hmm. That specific example is something that I actually tried and tried to make fully automated, like trying to take screencasts from labor markets and try to break it down and execute it for much less with microtasks by just managing the process automatically, of course.
Blows my mind. I could wrap my head around this like crowd wisdom and crowdsourcing the work for like a micro task that's very simple. Like if you have to identify something on an image, but it's like hard for me to even wrap my head around how it would work when you're talking about more complex, complicated tasks that you think of as jobs that require like
Yeah.
dedicated human involvement here, like a production of a video, like you were saying.
Yeah, it requires you to think of different processes that are much more modular and much more adaptive to those techniques. It's not necessarily the same process. It's a different process, but potentially it can be much more efficient. And in software, for example, you have modular thinking. So you build a software that is built well is built that small teams can work on different components of it. Mm-hmm. I think the same kind of thinking can be applied to many other kind of work processes and projects.
So this is fun. I don't think I didn't expect to go so long without talking about LiquidApps or DAP Network too much. That was kind of the goal here, this new concept. So everyone watching, let us know in the comments what you think about getting to know the leaders in this industry, EOS and blockchain as a whole. You have such an interesting background, Ty. I'm really glad I got to have you be kind of the champion of this new concept here. I think we will have to have you back on again to talk in more detail about LiquidApps and DAP Network. But it's been really fun getting to hear some of these stories about your background and some of, I'd say you validated some of the legend. I think the legend is still legitimate and the legend is still real.
Thank you.
Is there anything that we missed that we want to hit on before we sign off here?
Probably a lot, but I hope it's going to be one of many.
I'm glad we were able to get you away from your terminal window for a little bit, so that the rest of the EOS and DAP Network community could get to know you better as a person. We sign off the show here in a very specific way. Are you aware of how that works?
Go EOS?
Almost. So you got to say, until next time, I'm Tal Muskal.
Okay. Until next time, I'm Tal Muskal.
And I'm Zack Gall. And this is Everything EOS. Go.
Okay. And you say this is everything EOS. Okay.
And this is everything EOS. Go EOS.